Many of the remedies are not rocket science. They can be fixed pretty easily. Coming up with a policy statement, figuring out who within your company needs to kind of be organizing this. The tools related to risk assessment, they're all there. This is to protect yourself. It's very easy. If you don't, and we did an analysis of about 10 companies that got themselves into trouble, it's about $64 million average loss as a result of market share and sales and so forth. You can't mess around with something like this. All somebody has to do is accuse you of modern slavery, and you have a real big issue on your hands.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hi, this is Gwen Hassan, and welcome to the very first inaugural episode of Hidden Traffic. I am honored today to have as my first guest, Matt Friedman. He is not only the CEO, but also the founder of the Mekong Club. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm really excited to have you here because I'll give the listeners a little background. The first time that I heard you speak was here in Chicago at an event hosted by the Chicago Regional Business Ethics Network. It was downtown, right on the river. And I attended because I thought, human trafficking, that's something I don't know anything about. And quite frankly, I was a little skeptical. I remember thinking to myself, does that really exist? What is that? I'm not sure. And after listening to you for an hour, I left that meeting just, as my teen children would say, shook. I mean, I was really impacted by your story and the work that you're doing. So I'm really glad to be able to kind of bring it full circle now years later and have you on the podcast. So why don't we start a little bit with, could you tell us about the Mekong Club, what it is and why you founded it? That would be a great place to start.
Very good. The Mekong Club is an organization that works with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery. Now, for certain sectors within the private sector, it's quite obvious why they would be concerned about this. For example, manufacturers have to be concerned about their supply chains and sweatshops and so forth. But the banking industry has to be concerned about this because $150 billion is generated annually. And if any of that money gets into a legitimate bank and anyone finds out, they'll be fined for money laundering. In fact, in Australia, there was a bank that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars for not tracking online sexual exploitation of children. You also have retailers that are being sued for buying, let's say, seafood from Thailand, where they basically are told that they are buying something that's tainted by modern slavery. In the hospitality industry, you have forced prostitution. You have people who are brought in from the outside with third-party contracts that could be exploitative. They have supply chains and they have construction. So we work with the private sector. We help them to understand the issue and what they need to do in order to address it. So ours is an association. We have about 60 members. Most of the members would be large companies, Fortune 500 type companies. And when we onboard them, the first thing we do is an assessment. We sit down with them and identify where they are in their journey of addressing modern slavery. This looks at their leadership, their policies, risk assessments, what they do if they find the issue, sustainability. And as a result of that process, we then help them to develop a strategy. The strategy basically focuses on kind of figuring out over a period of time all of the things that they need to do in order to address the problem. As part of that process, we also on a quarterly basis meet with our association members. And during these meetings, we debate, discuss, and determine what it is that they protect their business. So, for example, the bank said that they wanted relationship manager training. And so we developed a 3.5-hour training, went all over Asia, and basically provided this. They wanted typologies. Basically, typologies are breaking the act of modern slavery into component parts, identifying the transactions along the way, which of those could be considered to be nefarious. And then they use those packaged nefarious indicators to look at big data to see whether or not there is bad stuff taking place.
Okay.
We developed e-learning toolkit that has 15 4.5-minute films in multiple languages. We developed dashboards that help to identify the geographical risk in a location relative to commodity risk so that people can determine the amount of due diligence that's needed. So just about everything you could possibly imagine related to looking at every aspect of a company's vulnerability is addressed by this particular mechanism that we've developed as part of the Mekong Club.
That's fantastic. I knew that you had a unique position among kind of associations in this space in that your focus was on companies and working with the private sector. But I will admit, I didn't realize that you had all of those resources. So that's fantastic. What a great kind of one-stop shop for a company that's trying to figure out how to tackle this issue and use some of their corporate resources to get in front of it. I think that's fantastic. Could you go a little personal for a minute and tell us about why you started the Mekong Club and what was your personal journey to getting into this space? I know you used to be in healthcare, so where did you go from there to get to here?
Okay, I'll go all the way back to 30 years ago. At that time, I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was basically to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. It's a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the girls and pretty much heard the same story over and over again. It went something like this. Human trafficker would go into a community, flash a bunch of money around. He wanted people to think he was rich. He'd then say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife, want a village wife. He'd find a girl 12 years old, befriend her, and go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. Now, in that part of the world, it's not unusual. You often see people marrying very young, especially in the villages. Families thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. A couple of days later, they actually have the wedding ceremony. The entire community's there. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'd like to take your daughter to Kathmandu now, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India, the red light district. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these women dressed funny, these men milling around. She said, no, don't leave me. I'm afraid. He says, it's okay. You just stay here. He then goes to the madam to get the $600 for having sold her to the brothel.
Oh,
he has the gold from the wedding, and he leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year.
Oh.
The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, as I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When she internalizes this, many of the girls say, I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then brings out the photographs of the wedding and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day time, they rape this poor girl 30 times until she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her.
Oh, my gosh.
After that, she's put on the line. She'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she gets what's called black eye. But she's so depleted physically, emotionally, spiritually, nobody wants her. They throw her out onto the street. If she's lucky, she gets back to Nepal. Many of them don't. So I was hearing this story over and over again. And something about this particular issue was in my DNA. It really, really bothered me.
Yeah.
But it didn't cross over the line until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim.
Oh, my God.
This girl saw this Caucasian guy, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress 10 sizes too big because she was a child in the adult's world. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. So we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. I said, well, if we try to leave, they'll kill us both.
Oh.
Make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell that story because, I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while, we are tested in life. That was my big test. I failed miserably. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. And I did what a lot of activists do. I kind of surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. So that's the personal genesis of entering into modern slavery. So I spent 8 years in Nepal addressing that, another 5 years in Bangladesh, went to Thailand, and I was working there, kind of looking at regional programs for the U.S. government. Then I jumped ship and joined the United Nations. And at that time, I was running one of the largest counter-trafficking programs in the world. We had offices in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar. And what was happening prior to that is nobody really knew how many people were estimated to be in modern slavery or human trafficking, whichever term you choose to use. But then the number came out, 21 million. And so everyone was using 21 million. But at the same time, we knew that the world was only helping about 34,000, which means that with all of the NGOs and governments and United Nations combined, we were helping 0.2% of the victims. So when we put those two numbers together, it was a very sobering day. We were quite, upset. We're not having any effect at all. So we went back to the numbers. And when we looked at the numbers said 75% of the 21 million are in forced labor, and 60% of them are associated with supply chains. So we knew that we had to be focusing on supply chains. Okay. So I started to fly up to Hong Kong to talk to the captains of industry there, because we wanted to understand what the private sector knew about this issue. And it was very interesting. We would go and I'd walk into a meeting, and initially these people said, well, hadn't really heard about that. Understand the business risk, but I don't want to have a conversation with somebody like you. You come from that naming and shaming world. Mm-hmm. And so we knew that there was something that was happening there. We knew we needed to be more involved, but me being a United Nations official didn't make it easier. So we set up the Mekong Club initially to sensitize C-suite, director level people. We did the kind of the panels, the conferences, the workshops, all those types of things. And we called it the Mekong Club because the name doesn't mean anything. If you're working with the private sector and you say you're going to do human rights, it'll scare them away. So you need to have a name that basically is neutral. So for the first couple of years, I just focused on kind of the presentations, having meetings and consultations. But then a number of things changed. You had transparency legislation, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, the Modern Slavery Act. Those acts basically said if you're a big company, you got to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. And so they needed to learn about it. You saw lawsuits against major companies, retailers being sued because they were buying seafood from Thailand. I already mentioned that. The cocoa industry was being sued. This was a huge reputational risk. You saw media coverage increasing almost every year for the past 5 years, doubling. And so this has become a phenomenon. In ESG also became an important topic. Yeah. Teachers in Canada were saying, how do we know that our retirement fund isn't supporting modern slavery? So as a result of all of these things, that's when we switched over to be an association, because the community we were working with said we need a safe space to work collectively as multi-stakeholders coming together to have a community response to this. Because if one company gets into trouble, the assumption is that everybody else is in the same situation.
Oh, that's fantastic. Your story is so moving. I'm going to quibble with you, though, for your characterization of that as the situation in Mumbai being a failure on your part. I think you did what you could. I mean, what anyone could do in that situation, and then took it to the nth degree after that to create a whole system of companies and people around the world who are working to make sure that the number of little girls who get caught in that situation is far fewer. So that doesn't sound like failure to me, Matt, but...
Well, it certainly felt like failure at the time. The thing about activism is that there is this kind of social burden that we kind of hold on to, the fact that we're helping 0.2% of the victims. And that can burn people out, because maybe you help 1,000 people, but you realize that there's millions left. In fact, kind of the way we get around that is, do you know the starfish parable?
I don't. Please share.
Okay, so what counter-trafficking people do is they use this parable as a means of helping to feel okay about the pace at which we work. And the way the parable works is there's a 10-kilometer beach, and the father and son are walking down the beach, and the father sees a starfish, picks it up, throws it in the water, sees another one, picks it. The beach is littered with these starfish that have been beached. The son looks at the father and says, "This beach is so long, you can't possibly help all these starfish. What difference does it make?" Father looks to the son and says, "Well, to each starfish that gets into the water, it makes all the difference in the world." The point is that we have to take each of our victories one at a time and kind of accept the fact that we've contributed, not maybe as much as we would like to, but at least something is being done. And a lot of the people who work in this industry try to find things like that help them to kind of cope with the fact that 0.2% of the victims are being helped. That means a lot of other people are not.
Are not. So I like the idea that the Mekong Club is based on, which is the scalability of intervention, right? So if you're taking companies with arguably a lot more assets at their disposal, and you can kind of, for lack of a better term, proselytize the cause throughout, then it creates a domino effect that hopefully increases that 0.2% to something higher over time. Talk to me a bit about what you think the role of corporate compliance programs is in helping to kind of deputize these companies to take action. Does it belong in compliance? Does it belong in supply chain? Shouldn't it be part of a company's DNA? Where do you see it fitting and where's it headed?
I'm going to answer that by starting with corporate social responsibility.
Okay.
So was it 25, 30 years ago? You didn't have a corporate social responsibility office. Companies just made profit, prestige, and growth. That was their basic objectives. Then people came along and said, okay, well, we need corporations to do good. And so this concept of corporate social responsibility was set up. And so you'd have an office, and in that office, they would support education and disability and maybe a small program to help out a local charity and so forth. And so what they would say is, we're awesome because we're doing these things. Okay, so we don't have to kind of answer all the questions about pollution and the planet and everything else because we have this.
I'm getting an image of that Wizard of Oz movie, right? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Look at the flashy, shiny stuff over here. Yeah,
that's a great analogy. And so I always felt like the spirit of what corporate social responsibility was supposed to be, which is the office that would look at every aspect of goodness from the perspective of, like, if somebody asked them what the company was. And so I don't really feel like it achieved its overall objective. Then sustainability came in, and people talked about the importance of sustainability and everything else, but it was very theoretical. And so then ESG was the next incarnation because they said, if you're going to be sustainable, you have to measure it. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance, basically kind of takes the interface between a company and the world, whether it's the planet, community, workers, and so forth, and it measures it. And initially, it was very much geared towards volunteerism. So the big companies would want to do this because they want to say we're awesome. So the investors would go and say, here's an awesome company that's doing right by the world, et cetera, et cetera. And we're seeing that, in fact, the big funds that focus on ESG have much higher returns than the funds that don't. Yeah. So there is a dividend. But what's happening kind of post-COVID is ESG is pretty much on steroids. The world expects, in addition to profit, prestige, and growth, that a company does right by the world, by the planet, by people, and so forth. And so you're seeing so much more emphasis. There are organizations that are hiring thousands of people, investing millions, if not billions of dollars on this particular topic. So kind of what compliance looks at is risk. So you have a situation where the compliance people are looking at, are we going to get in trouble because we have forced labor in a situation? Are we going to get in trouble because we are polluting? Are we going to get in trouble? So the risk component of that, for the most part, had usually been internal. They would do this in order to protect themselves. There's very little of that would make it into the public realm. Yeah. But with the modern slavery legislation, they have to report on that. They have to say what they're doing. They have to say if they find something, how they fix it, and so forth. And so you're almost seeing that corporate social responsibility and compliance in ESG are all coming together as one. Yeah. And to a certain extent, I think that they should just combine these things. The interesting thing about transparency is that there were a couple of companies that really felt like they found modern slavery in their supply chains. It's very public. I can say this, Patagonia and Nestle. And they came out in articles and they said, we found it, we're going to fix it. And I remember there was a public relations organization that contacted me and said, we can't get anyone to quote on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, because we don't know whether it's going to blow up in their face or it's going to be okay. I said, my gosh, this is a wonderful thing. The fact that they're talking about this, they're transparent. And as it turned out to be good for both of them. Yeah. It basically demonstrated that they were being honest to the world about what they found. And they said they were going to fix it. And people said, okay, we really like that. We assume everybody else is in the same situation. But these organizations were honest enough to say something. So I think compliance people need to understand that the world is changing and that there is this expectation that people are going to ask questions about companies for two reasons, whether they buy their products or whether or not they invest in them.
Yeah. And taking that then and using it as an opportunity to build credibility with all of those stakeholders, whether it's your employees, whether it's investors, whether it's customers. I think that is the bottom line message that I take away from this whole area is it's not a nice to have or a public relations, stunt of some kind. This is about really internalizing as a company what your values are going to be. And if it's being a good corporate citizen and taking care of the world that you're operating in and being transparent and being aggressively compliant in areas where it really makes a difference for people's lives, like the ones you shared with us earlier, I think that's what we're headed towards. And I do see that kind of merger of compliance and corporate social responsibility and ESG kind of coming together to have the same goals and the same kind of set of drivers behind what they do every day.
Gwen, let me just add to that. I wrote a book called Be the Hero, Be the Change, and it's basically a book on volunteerism. And so I've had some major companies have me come in and do a talk on volunteerism, not specifically related to human trafficking, but on all different topics. And what ultimately happens afterwards is the employees would come up to me and say, oh my gosh, wow, our company cares. They're spending time to allow us to be able to do this. They're encouraging us. We feel really good about our company. We had some doubts maybe in the past, but now we really feel like they are walking the talk. And so I say that because, a lot of companies spend a lot of money to try to get the world to look good at them. Yeah. But if their own people don't, then that's a real problem. And there are a lot of companies that have that kind of dynamic. The other thing I want to say, this goes back to something you said just a few minutes ago about the size of the potential impact in working with companies. So for years, I did public sector work or human rights work in countries. And so you're confined to the geographical location. If you take a big company that has 500,000 employees and you're able to influence them all the way from C-suite down, tentacles within their supply chain and networks go all over the world, and 500,000 people basically are trained, are equipped, are put into situations where systems, processes, and procedures protect people. And if you do that times 50 companies, you're talking about millions and millions of people. I think having worked in the NGO world where it's a very small geographical coverage versus working with the private sector, I can't imagine going back to the NGO world because we influence big companies. They do the right thing and they will do the right thing because they don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want their business to be hurt. You can see a significant impact well beyond what the investment is that we put into just helping these organizations.
Well, I hope that in part this podcast can help move that goal forward because I'm hopeful that I'll get people to listen and to learn more. I've already had a few people reach out to me about, well, where do I start? And what would be a good place for me to figure out how to do a risk assessment for my supply chain? And so I'm hopeful that this will kind of move that ball forward even further into the corporate compliance world, and they can take it back to their organizations and we can press forward together.
Yeah, Gwen, one of the things that we just launched last Friday was a very simple tool, which is kind of a litmus test for a manufacturing company to figure out where they are in their journey in addressing modern slavery. 25 questions. Takes about 4 minutes to fill it out. You fill it out, and then you get a number out of 100. And then you can compare that number to the average of the other people who filled it out. And the reason why that's important is a lot of people think that supply chain kind of risk assessment is what modern slavery response is all about. It includes policy statements. It includes training. It includes having a hierarchy of people who work within the organization. It includes risk assessment tools. It includes audits, includes worker grievance approaches, includes sustainability, all those things. And so when they fill it out, they come to realize that out of 100, maybe they get 38, thinking that they were doing a lot better. But behind the ball here, when it comes to where other companies are, because for the most part, many of the remedies are not rocket science. They can be fixed pretty easily. Coming up with a policy statement, figuring out who within your company needs to kind of be organizing this. The tools related to risk assessment, they're all there. This is to protect yourself. It's very easy. If you don't, and we did an analysis of about 10 companies that got themselves into trouble, it's about $64 million average loss as a result of market share and sales and so forth. You can't mess around with something like this. All somebody has to do is accuse you of modern slavery, and you have a real big issue on your hands. And to put this into perspective, if a factory holds the passports of employees and somebody finds out that's an indicator of modern slavery, and that goes into the newspapers, they can say modern slavery. In reality, maybe they were holding them because the employees asked them to because they had no lockers, but it doesn't matter to the reader. So there's tremendous potential vulnerability in this type of situation, and companies need to understand that vulnerability.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, Matt, and all you've shared with us. Where can people get more information about Mekong Club and you, for that matter? And where can they get your book if they want it?
Book is on Amazon. I encourage people to go onto our website, themekongclub.org. Lots of information there. They can contact me directly if they have questions. I'm happy to respond to them. We often do consultations to help sensitize people to the issue. We're an NGO. That's what we do. Our goal is to make the world a better place. And so we do this because we see working with the private sector as the means to achieve that end.
Well, I think you're well on your way, Matt, and I'm happy to support you in that effort. So thank you again very much for being with us today, and best wishes always. Stay well.
Thank you so much.